My name is David Wiss, and I am a registered dietitian nutritionist. I don't have disclaimers or disclosures, and I am a doctor of public health with a minor in health psychology. I practice functional medicine. Please follow me on social media. And yes, I'm a clinician in practice for over 10 years. My practice is called Nutrition and Recovery. I have a background in a lot of different fields. So social sciences, nutritional sciences, public health, psychology, and my goal is to bring it all together here for you today. We're going to talk about these controversies in the eating disorder field, really hoping to provide some additional perspective, not pick a side, but to provide opposing views and really hope to encourage dialectical thinking. We're going to talk a little bit about how ultra-processed foods affect nutrition, the data we have on ultra-processed foods and mental health, ultra-processed food addiction, and what about ultra-processed food and eating disorders? I think that's the main objective today, and of course, bringing it all together toward the end. This is a visual schematic of where this is all headed. We know that ultra-processed foods generally don't contain any intact unprocessed foods, or what we call Nova 1. With ultra-processed foods, it's a major contributor of refined sugars, contributes to intestinal permeability through low-fiber foods, reduced flavonoids, and we know that these foods are linked to depression, cognitive decline, and dementia. But here's the big question. It's a big puzzle with the eating disorders because often these foods are used as a part of eating disorder treatment under the guise of all foods fit. And we're going to call this a blind spot today because, of course, we have ultra-processed food addiction and some of the other related comorbidities. Perhaps there are some harm reduction approaches that could cater to both sides of the fence. Maybe there is abstinence from specific ultra-processed foods that consistently trigger binge eating, but perhaps moderation with some of the other foods that don't lead to such problematic overeating. So the term ultra-processed foods is not new. It's been in use for nearly half a century. It seems there's a pattern of those of us who advocate or express concern about the harms of these foods are often labeled as pseudoscientists and food fattists and generally have been marginalized and omitted from opportunities to share such important issues in the arena of global health. So let's get into it right away. I think it's safe to say that the mainstream nutrition field has been captured. Some of the credentialing organizations do have a long and suspicious history of undisclosed relationships with big food, big pharma, and big ag. And this isn't coming from an outsider. This is someone that's been in the field. I have been at the conferences. I've been on committees. I have been in the trenches. And I can say that I have definitely experienced such conflicts of interest. I want to say that there are changes happening. So it's not just a criticism, but these changes have been slow. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics oversees registered dietitians, and registered dietitians are largely responsible for the nutritional management of eating disorders. So you could already see there the food company agenda, the academy, the dietitians, and the eating disorders. There is already a connection. So this conversation about ultra-processed foods contributing to loss of control eating has been a major point of contention and division in my field. The eating disorder field mostly operates under the framework that all loss of control eating comes from dieting, restrictive, restrained eating, diet culture, internalized weight stigma, and orthorexia nervosa. We all know that this is not true, and we have evidence to support that. People tend to focus on those targets because they seem like things that can be changed. And I think most people operate under the assumption that we can't do anything about the food environment. We can't do anything about big food. So we're just going to have to live with the food environment that we're in and help people stop getting crazy about it, stop dieting. Well, maybe we can actually change the food environment. Maybe there are some policies that can make a difference. So there's this increasing number of nutrition professionals that attribute concerns about these foods to fear-mongering and diet culture. And there's a lot of social media accounts that are dedicated to myth busting about food and about eating. And the general effort is that they're debunking these concerns about ultra-processed foods and how they interact with homeostatic hunger. And again, as an eating disorder clinician, I want to say that I know some of these people and I know that they're well-intentioned and they have the goal of eating disorder prevention. Not all of them are working with the food industry. They genuinely have a career focused on people with restrictive eating disorders and are making content to help people. What happens is that the food companies find them and then find ways to sponsor them and to amplify their voice. When these debunking videos come out and these charged blogs come out, I think that it does invalidate those who struggle with hedonic eating or addiction-like eating. Check the comments. And I do believe that there is a forgotten group of those that have addiction-like eating that have been highly marginalized by the mainstream nutrition discourse, potentially perpetuating shame and the internalization of weight stigma. So let's get into some of the biology, linking ultra-processed foods to various health outcomes. There's some great data, some of the mechanisms. I think it's important that we understand some of these pathways. Of course, it's displacement, not eating real food, consuming ultra-processed foods in lieu of the real thing, a poor nutritional profile, so a low micro or phytonutrient density of the foods. But then, of course, there's other reasons why ultra-processed foods are problematic. Some of the neoform compounds from the high heat processes, jarring or canning, there are compounds that end up in the food. Inflammatory responses to some of the additives like emulsifiers and flavoring agents, etc. And of course, the packaging from plastics. We all understand the higher glycemic load from processed carbs, the reduced fiber volume, the shifts in the gut microbial ecosystem. That's a whole nother talk in itself. Gut environment gets compromised. We can also have intestinal permeability, also sometimes referred to as leaky gut. And then of course, addiction-like eating, which we'll talk about today. But I just want to highlight that the problems with ultra-processed foods in mental health context, eating disorder context, goes above and beyond just food addiction. You've probably seen some of the data. It's an umbrella review of the meta-analysis that put together all the data points, nearly 10 million people, higher risks of prevalent anxiety, depression, etc. Those are the things that we're going to talk more about. But generally speaking, we have data linking ultra-processed foods to anxiety, but the overwhelming weight of the evidence suggests that depression is stronger because there is a dose response risk. And there are large prospective studies that show increased ultra-processed food links to higher incident depression after extensive adjustment, physical activity, TV viewing, etc. And that these dose response findings often emerge in adolescence, even after adjusting for factors such as self-perceived body image and bullying victimization. We know that higher ultra-processed food consumption correlates with boredom, crying, fear, worry, loneliness, unhappiness. Among young adults, factors such as being unmarried and smoking, alcohol, negative health perception, and high levels of perceived stress correlate with higher ultra-processed food consumption. According to a recent meta-analysis, for every 10% increase in ultra-processed food consumption relative to the daily caloric intake, there is an 11% higher risk of depression. To date, we have at least 7 randomized controlled trials showing depression levels significantly decrease after counseling, encouraging real food, minimally processed foods, reducing ultra-processed foods. And importantly, these studies were not weight loss studies. Those were all excluded from this systematic review. When we go back to mechanisms, there are specific mechanisms that link ultra-processed foods in the diet to depressive symptoms. I think the obvious is nutrient deficiencies and so many roles that these nutrients play in the body. They're all important. Let's just say that. Some are more important than others. Oxidative stress, which we know can lead to inflammation. We talked about leaky gut, but there's also leaky brain, blood-brain barrier permeability, the HPA axis, which is responsible for the output of cortisol in humans, neuroendocrine hormones, leptin, insulin resistance. We're learning more and more about metabolic psychiatry, endocrine disruption from some of those neoform compounds I spoke of, mitochondrial dysfunction, brain function and volume. So not just size and the shape of the brain, but how they connect to other parts of the brain, especially related to eating patterns. The integrity of the brain, which is often linked to omega-3 fatty acids, which get into the membranes. It seems like omega-3 gets the spotlight because it's a direct path toward brain health. And then BDNF, which is related to synaptic plasticity, the rewiring of the brain. And we know that there's a lot of factors that can increase BDNF production, such as exercise. And then, of course, there's serotonin, which I'll talk about more. But I saw some really great research suggesting that while we know that tryptophan has a fate toward serotonin, it has other fates as well. So based on the gut environment, based on the inflammatory environment, tryptophan can be diverted to kynurenine, which can then become quinolinic acid, which we know is neuroinflammatory. Yeah, that's why I've always been cautious about amino acid precursors for mental health. It's not just what you take, but the environment in which you take it. And then, of course, always, which we'll get to, the dopamine overactivation with addiction-like eating. This came out about 2 years ago, and it was not without debate. A lot of letters to the editor on this one. This particular umbrella review suggested that the main areas of serotonin research provide no consistent evidence of there being an association between serotonin and depression. So it doesn't mean that there's no evidence, it's just not consistent. So what that means is that there are other phenotypes of depression. The inflammatory phenotype of depression addiction, which can be linked to the biological embedding of adversity. So just to bring it all together, there's a lot of mechanisms that reflect alterations among multiple levels of this gut-brain axis, and that this isn't just a matter of taking a daily multiple. A multivitamin will be great and helpful, but we're actually talking about systems biology. And it's increasingly recognized that this gut microbiota is also involved in shifts from homeostatic eating to hedonic eating. And therefore, we will move into the next portion to discuss ultra-processed food addiction. And this has been highly charged in my eating disorder field. I've been one of the lone voices here. And I think that a lot of other folks who are in the eating disorder field who have had a point of view here have bailed because they just couldn't stand the social pressure. The social pressure comes from this strong assumption, which is that the ultra-processed food addiction construct is harmful because it promotes restriction. And I think a lot of people, and I've seen it happen, a lot of people that, knew that this was a phenomenon basically changed their minds because they just couldn't deal with being ostracized by the group. So I do represent a person who's willing to be a sole dissenting voice on matters of principle. And I have continued to persist with this conversation in the eating disorder space, despite canceling and despite a lot of efforts to silence, etc. That's who I am. I'm the one that has tried to push this conversation gently in the eating disorder world, and then also try to bring a little bit more eating disorder informed ideology to the food addiction world, which is some of what we're going to do today. This addiction like eating concept has not been without debate. We've got this Yale Food Addiction Scale 2.0, which asks about symptoms and behaviors related to specific ultra-processed foods. We have since started using the term ultra-processed food addiction based on this NOVA classification to make the old term food addiction a little bit less vague. And I think it's an important shift because over a decade of research has demonstrated that ultra-processed foods can elicit addiction-like biological and behavioral responses, whereas these unprocessed or minimally processed foods do not. Based on some recent data, we know that ultra-processed food addiction criteria is met by about 14% in the general population, much higher in clinical samples, closely mirroring prevalence estimates for substance use disorder. And we're seeing about 12% among children and adolescents, which we could say is a level of addiction unprecedented among the youth, of course, if you don't consider phones and screens. So if you look at the estimates for eating disorder, it's much higher. And I think this is one of the reasons why the eating disorder field has a bone to pick with this, because you're seeing people that have bulimia nervosa demonstrating 80s, 90s. I've seen studies that were 100% of the people meet criteria for ultra-processed food addiction. And the clinicians that work in that space are seeing people get better by eating ultra-processed foods in quote unquote moderation. I think a lot of people then decide that this is useless, meaningless, and want to just discard the construct altogether. Meanwhile, there's a pretty high dropout rate in eating disorder treatment. There's a lot of people who are dissatisfied, are never going to go back. I've tried to scratch my head and talk to folks about, what about the people that actually do have ultra-processed food addiction driving their eating disorder versus those that have an eating disorder that drives ultra-processed food addiction symptoms. I've noticed that people are having a hard time being able to think about this confusing intersection space and the temporal sequence and how to discern. I think a lot of people are looking for support there. We did write a paper a few years ago called Separating the Signal from the Noise in the at least beginning thought process of learning how to discern. So we know that ultra-processed food addiction is linked to higher rates of ultra-processed food. Shocker. And for each additional symptom, the percentage energy from these foods is higher and the percentage energy from minimally processed foods as lower. And because ultra-processed foods can directly cause biological changes, they pose unique challenges for dietary change and improvement. So people are struggling to be able to change their eating. And I think a lot of us understand why, but we're still trying to figure out what is the solution. When homeostatic dietary interventions, such as just use portion control or eat less of the same foods, they fail partially because it ignores the contribution of these foods to hedonic eating. One explanation related to addiction is higher levels of impulsivity, negative urgency. And given this food environment, it's not surprising that nutrition habits are challenging to change in the face of these various life stressors and ongoing psychosocial adversity. So let's talk about the eating disorder stuff. This is what I'm calling, and Dr. Aton actually called in a paper, a blind spot in eating disorder research and treatment. So the contemporary mindset, I'm going to go ahead and call it dogma, very unflexible in the thought process around food philosophies, is that all foods fit. It's a helpful message. I want to say that because it's designed to combat diet culture among those who either have or are at risk of a restrictive eating disorder. For someone that has a lot of unwarranted food fears, being all inclusive with food is actually a good treatment recommendation. The problem is that this treatment recommendation gets extrapolated to all people that have disordered eating. And that's where a lot of us are saying, okay, we got to go back to the drawing board because there's harm being caused. You could trace the all foods fit spirit back to Fairborn's transdiagnostic theory that proposes that there are common mechanisms across the spectrum of eating disorders. So it sort of assumes that, people with anorexia nervosa just have very similar traits as those with binge eating disorder. And of course, my parent organization, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, has published the Total Diet Approach, which is a very industry-friendly messaging that suggests all foods can fit if consumed in moderation and appropriate portion size. We could scratch our heads about the conflicts of interest here, and I think some of it's really obvious, but a lot of the eating disorder dietitians really like this message because they might not have a food addiction, so they don't truly identify with it. They work with clients that are restrictive, and they genuinely believe that not demonizing any foods or specific ingredients are the way forward. So the dietitians are the primary gatekeepers in eating disorder treatment. So as I've pointed to, it's not surprising that the food philosophies in most of these facilities reflect this prevailing narrative. Many of the presentations of restrictive eating disorders like anorexia nervosa do attempt to diet in harmful ways and limit many foods unnecessarily and harmfully. So adopting this philosophy can be critical for many people seeking treatment in order to ameliorate these behavioral and psychological extremes. It's an inclusive approach to eating that aligns with social justice issues related to weight stigma, and it's all part of the quote-unquote anti-diet movement. And I will say that it's valid and it warrants prioritization in many of the clinical interventions, but not all. We need more nuance. So for other people that have eating disorders, particularly those of binge type and have more complex symptomatology, concurrent ultra-processed food addiction, substance use disorder, depression, GI issues, we're screaming it from the rooftop. More nuance is needed. We need to assess for dietary restraint, as well as early life adversity through ACE scores and other measures, PTSD symptoms. So the question, and I certainly don't have the full answer, but I want to pose it to everyone. When is it appropriate to address addiction-like eating patterns of ultra-processed foods during efforts to provide treatment and care? It does seem like people that are all the way into food addiction are like always, and people that have eating disorder-informed approaches are like never. And so, yeah, we're building an army of people that are willing to ask this question and get curious and to do some trial and error and to get in alignment with the patient, but also be willing to challenge them if you think that there's some other stuff going on. Meanwhile, very few treatment centers are willing to acknowledge the role of ultra-processed food addiction during eating disorder treatment. Maybe it's too much nuance. Maybe it's a cognitive load outside the pay grade. Some insist the condition doesn't exist. Others believe it to be harmful. And the argument is that it stimulates unwarranted fears and rules. And could it in some cases? Sure. Yeah. Could the opposite be harmful where you tell someone that they don't have it, it doesn't exist, and they do have it? Sure. So my mission is make peace and stop causing harm in the field, the nutrition field, which is a battlefield and feels super unsafe for a lot of people. So as a result of this food philosophy, little attention is given to the food quality. Any form of avoidance is actively discouraged. The emphasis is on the social and psychological factors like the social media, the weight stigma. They're considered more important than the biological stuff. And some would say that those psychological and social factors can be more targeted, whereas this food environment can't, or can it? The eating disorder field generally ignores the direct contribution of ultra-processed foods in driving overconsumption. Again, creates a forgotten group that's marginalized by this mainstream nutrition discourse. And of course, we have people that meet criteria for both ultra-processed food addiction and eating disorders documented to have worse clinical conditions and symptoms. And this may explain their higher levels of treatment dropout among those with addiction-like eating. Many have accepted this calories in, calories out hypothesis without criticism. While increasing caloric intake may be the first treatment priority for some underweight patients, this calorie model doesn't adequately capture other key biological mechanisms of food and eating behavior. In one study of eating disorder patients, those with anorexia nervosa consumed 55% ultra-processed foods, which is just less than the population average. Those with bulimia nervosa and binge eating disorder consumed about 70%, which is just above the population average. But here it is, 100% of the foods consumed in binge episodes were ultra-processed foods. And I want to highlight that when I take a stance against ultra-processed foods, foods. I'm also taking a stance against these diet products, these diet sodas, fat-free salad dressings, low-calorie protein bars. A lot of people with eating disorders gravitate towards these foods because they have calorie counts on them. And I'll show you an example. I am against the calories model. I'm not saying that it's not valid. I'm just saying that it's not complete. The eating disorder field needs to pay attention to the metabolic and neurobiological effects of modern foods in light of this new research. Most people, when they think of ultra-processed foods, think of the top, which is like an ice cream product. But if you look at the bottom, we see a low-calorie protein bar that has just as many ingredients and is considered an ultra-processed food. So I'm also recommending people move away from these diet foods as well. And that message is resonating with my folks in the eating disorder community. So another explanation, given the high degree of comorbidity between binge type EDs and ultra-processed food addiction, is that these foods are just more reinforcing. They're more addictive. They alter dopamine and they directly motivate consumption despite the negative consequences. According to observational research, ultra-processed food consumption is positively associated with binge eating and bulimia, but not purely with restrictive eating disorders like the restrictive type of anorexia nervosa. There's a higher intake of these foods that has been identified as a precursor to binge eating in children and adolescents. Of course, there are other drivers, genetics, parenting, gut microbiome, TV. In the eating disorder field, it's been accepted that all binging comes from restraint or restriction. That often comes from body image issues. And our available evidence does not support this absolute assertion. We know that there are other factors related to hedonic eating. One longitudinal study showed that ultra-processed food predicted dieting more than dieting predicted ultra-processed food addiction symptoms. And that just made a really strong case that people have to start thinking about, like, what is the real driver? People know that dieting is a problem. Where does all the dieting come from in the first place? And I think it's obvious that a lot of it comes from the food that's in the food environment that are driving these problems, and we need to think upstream. Some of this initial addiction-like eating could create the dieting, which may reflect an attempt to protect oneself from the overstimulating properties of ultra-processed foods. Someone might be trying to lose weight, and then, it results in binge eating. And we know that not all binge eating is directly linked to restriction. There are other mechanisms. This abundance of ultra-processed food can create cravings and promote binge-like eating. I think most people understand that now. The most confusing part is this anorexia nervosa research. Based on the ultra-processed food measure of the Yale Food Addiction Scale, more than half of people with anorexia nervosa meet the criteria for it. So it is possible, a couple theories here, that those with anorexia nervosa do restrain their eating to control the exposure to very stimulating ultra-processed foods. They might have a hypersensitive neural response, and therefore they are prone to gravitating away from it. But on the other hand, increased neural responses could also result from the dieting. So it's hard to know, does the hedonic response drive the dieting, or does the dieting drive the hedonic response? And it really is a both and rather than an either or. But I think it's safe to say that there's at least two phenotypes of anorexia nervosa in this concept: those that have restrictive features secondary to addiction-like eating, and those that have originally restrictive tendencies without any clear addiction-like mechanisms. But it's interesting, right? Because people are screening positive in the eating disorder world, and we need to think about those that have a meaningful positive screening versus those that might have more of a noisy signal. So those with anorexia nervosa that screen positive, those with the restrictive type, do share more similarities with the binge purge type than those that have purely restrictive anorexia nervosa. So it's possible that ultra-processed food addiction symptoms could be an indicator of crossover from restrictive to binge purge type. But most likely, individuals with anorexia nervosa exhibit high levels of ultra-processed foods because the measurement is subjective and based on self-reported symptoms, and many people are perceiving them as addiction-like. So if you ask someone about their exaggerated perception of unsuccessful efforts to cut down, or their loss of control eating, or their urges, not able to think of anything else, there's high scores. My criticism of the Yale Food Addiction Scale is that it doesn't adequately capture someone that's in a starvation state, someone that lost a lot of weight. And of course, that's why we bring in other tools, other measurements. But notwithstanding, given that patients with ultra-processed food addiction exhibit different profiles than individuals without, we need personalized nutrition treatments that go beyond all foods fit. That myth just has to be dismantled. And just to give an extreme, and this has been somewhat of a head scratcher for the eating disorder community, we have case reports that describe remissions from anorexia nervosa with the ketogenic diet combined with ketamine. So there's just got to be more room for open-mindedness and other opportunities for nutrition interventions. And I want to share our recent research. This is from my private practice, actually collected data over about 3 years and got about 300 folks, mostly white women. More than half have a history of substance use disorder. 62% meet screening criteria for eating disorders. Basically, what we were able to do was model ACEs as an upstream driver and eating disorder symptoms as an outcome and look at some of the pathways. We used structural equation modeling and did some mediation analysis, and we're able to show all statistically significant associations. These estimates have been standardized, so you could think of them in relation to one another. Otherwise, they're not quite comparable. But I think the key findings that are emerging here are that the link between ACEs and eating disorders can be explained by PTSD symptoms. But there are alternative pathways, is that ACEs also lead to higher intake of ultra-processed food addiction symptoms, and this can lead to eating disorder symptoms. And of course, these pathways can be running concurrently, but we were able to describe them in this research as distinct, noteworthy, significant, and we were able to discuss it clinically. So let's start bringing it together. These mechanisms can't be ignored. The mechanisms contribute to associations between ultra-processed food intake and greater incidence rates of mental health conditions like depression, ultra-processed food, addiction, disordered eating, and it may provide insight into the nutritional management of PTSD. There's been some work on understanding the biological embedding of adversity and how that overlaps with depression and where ultra-processed foods fit in. But in the context of eating disorders, this conversation around ultra-processed food has only begun to emerge, but we know that the co-occurrence of ultra-processed food addiction and eating disorders is quite robust. So for many folks, it's still quite taboo to discuss food quality, for example, organic versus conventional or the degree of processing in any eating disorder context, because many individuals are very sensitive to this kind of messaging. And it's true. A food addiction conversation in the wrong crowd with the wrong person could be triggering. It doesn't mean that the food addiction conversation isn't true. It just means that if you're going to be a food addiction messenger, it is worth being sensitive to those that are deeply in their eating disorder and looking for signals to reinforce their eating disorder. There's a lot of fear that it can trigger symptoms of orthorexia nervosa, which I know is very controversial. I'm not sure that I'm fully on board with it, but it does exist and it is a concern, and a lot of folks in the mental health space are concerned about it, that some of this language could perpetuate additional restriction and restraint. And I don't know, this is what I've picked up. It's just a split. A lot of people in the eating disorder field say, you know what, these are the people I care about. I really don't care about these other people. It's not that I genuinely don't care, it's that I'm focused over here. And I've also noticed that in the addiction space, they're saying, well, this isn't an eating disorder. We don't have to be worried about what people with anorexia nervosa think or do. We're here to help our folks. And there's truth to all of that, but my call is to do some peacemaking and understand that there are ways to be sensitive to other groups and to work together and to collaborate and to find language that works so that we don't continue being at war with each other while the food companies continue to win. We know that patients are presenting for eating disorder treatment, asking about food addiction. We know that professionals are interested in receiving training. So we clearly have this unmet need for both patients and practitioners. We know that restriction and restraint are key drivers of many forms of disordered eating. We know that more nuance is needed to define some of these terms. Not all forms of restraint are pathological. But here are my questions. If an eating disorder patient has unresolving depression and wants to try the Mediterranean diet that's high in fibers and polyphenols and the right kinds of fats, would that be pathological restraint? Given that more than half of eating disorder patients have a mood disorder, it does appear to be a question worth asking. What about autoimmune issues? Gastrointestinal issues. We know that reducing ultra-processed foods does improve all of these conditions. And this is just highlighting that we have a lot of data showing the Mediterranean diet is being effective in depression and depressive symptoms. So, do all foods fit? What about an individual with a binge type eating disorder who clearly meets criteria for ultra-processed food addiction? It's pretty safe to say that for some of them, continued consumption of ultra-processed foods is what directly maintains the binge eating. It's not the dieting, it's the eating. In these cases, harm reduction approaches could consider finding some abstinence from some things and maybe being more flexible with others. I think it's a safe middle ground. I think when people become abstinent against everything and only eat a couple of foods, it's hard to believe that that's the only solution. Some people say it's the only solution, and maybe it is in the beginning, but over time, can we learn how to eat nuts or fruit and other foods that are minimally processed or unprocessed successfully? And I've taken the stance that yes, we should. I know that there's going to be someone that says, nope, someone will never be able to eat a fruit or a nut, but if we're talking about ultra-processed food addiction, I'm mostly interested in recovery from ultra-processed foods, but I'm also open-minded enough to understand that each one has their own journey. When we do this work with those that have food addiction, we can still address the internalization of weight stigma, the body shaming, the shame-based eating. It's all part of food addiction recovery. And I would say that very similar psychological treatments used for eating disorders can support ultra-processed food addiction, but the food plans might differ. In some severe cases of ultra-processed food addiction, we need a rigid rule-based approach. We need to remove all guesswork. Some people need no choices. Tell me what to eat, put me on a food plan, and I support it. Meanwhile, many might see it as pathological restriction or restraint. So to bring it all home, eating disorder clinicians and researchers are shown to have a decreased ability to seek alternative solutions compared to general mental health clinicians and researchers. This is an important paper, and I present this to my folks in the eating disorder world. The eating disorder field is supposed to be a haven of moderation and open-mindedness, but it shows that the clinicians who work in the eating disorder field are not flexible. We have data to show it. So if you're in the mental health space, you have to be flexible with food philosophies in order to treat a wide range of clinical presentations. Of course, this can be difficult when treatment is scaled and food service operations pose financial challenges. And of course, there's a cognitive load of cross-identifying with different approaches that can create barriers for people. And importantly, a lot of people have a lot of personal bias based on their own recovery and allegiance to a particular group. And I think this is worth mentioning. Too much groupthink can be harmful to patients. So is it time for nuance? Let's define a few types of restriction. What are the disordered characteristics and what are the possible areas for nuance? I think most people would say that counting calories and tracking them could be disordered. Only eating food with known calories, ignoring all the nutritional details of the food could be seen as disordered. But of course, in some cases, people that reduce calories by improving their food choices could be a part of recovery, especially if their disorder is centered on excessive impulsivity and mindless eating. Another form of restriction is macros. And this can be disordered when someone attributes a macronutrient to an undesirable body or has a tendency toward extremes to manage body image issues. The nuance could be that there are macronutrients that have important implications for brain health. So in someone's quest to achieve mental wellness, it's very possible that a lower protein approach, for example, plant-based, or a very low carb approach, for example, ketogenic, could actually stabilize the brain and thereby support mental health as long as they place sanity over vanity. We know that food groups can lend itself to some disordered characteristics when people define their diet by the food groups that they don't eat and assign negative valence to an entire food group. Of course, the most controversial is grains and then dairy. When you start thinking about fruit, and then, like I said, nuts and seeds, some people are left eating very, very little foods, and I'm always concerned as a nutritionist that they're going to run into long-term nutrient deficiencies. So I do believe in variety when it comes to food and eating a wide range of different foods that are minimally processed. But of course, not everyone needs to eat all these food groups. Some people exclude them based on cultural reasons, dairy, or for preference. And sometimes the alternatives can work for people and sometimes they can't. Some people restrict based on quality, for example, organic versus conventional. This could look like orthorexia nervosa with just heightened fears around the food supply chain. Some people prioritize their perceived physical health at the expense of their mental health. And the nuance is that if someone shows an interest in agricultural practices, it's not necessarily pathological unless it leads to other forms of restriction, like refusing to eat when hungry. But yeah, many people find organic foods better, and it's not necessarily disordered to be interested in food quality. And then, of course, we have food processing, as we've talked about today. Some people can be disordered by just being extremely afraid of food and assigning it a lot of negative charge based on its processing and might just avoid avoid them for weight loss reasons or just magnified fears. But I would say that avoiding ultra-processed foods isn't always disordered. Some people benefit from eating less of these foods, especially if there's an addiction or an autoimmune issue or a GI issue. And some people also choose to consume less of these foods for spiritual or environmental reasons, which is not necessarily disorder. So to wrap it all up, I'm going to summarize the eating disorder versus the food addiction debate. In the eating disorder world, there is an assumption that the more you try to avoid the food, the more likely you are to crave it. In the food addiction world, we center on the assumption that the more you eat the food, the more likely you are to crave it. So the eating disorder view sees restriction as the driver, and that restriction drives the binge. But the food addiction view sees consumption as the driver, that the addiction is what drives the diet. The eating disorder view emphasizes the psychological and social factors in society that contribute to body ideals of thinness, whereas the food addiction view emphasizes the neurobiological factors of each individual that contribute to problematic eating. So eating disorder views weight stigma and diet culture as the key drivers, whereas food addiction views the food environment and the way that food changes the brain as the key drivers. Eating disorder treatment looks at the forest of the diet rather than the individual tree, and food addiction treatment recognizes how important individual trees can be in the forest ecosystem. Eating disorder view teaches inclusion with an all foods fit philosophy, whereas the food addiction view understands that some foods can be triggering for people and are better off excluded. Eating disorder philosophy teaches acceptance and how to navigate the food system we live in. Food addiction philosophy emphasizes change and ways to opt out of the food system. Eating disorder view does not see the food environment as a target for intervention, and food addiction view sees public health policy regulating food manufacturers as a viable target. In eating disorder, weight stigma is the social justice issue needing to be addressed, and other issues seem to be less important. Whereas in food addiction, prioritization of private profits over public health by major food corporation is the overlooked social justice issue. So the eating disorder view believes changing anti-fat attitudes is the solution, whereas the food addiction view believes that changing corporate greed and political power is the solution. So yeah, what side are you on? Pro tip. It can be both. So bringing it all home, ultra-processed foods are troublesome from social, cultural, economic, political, and environmental points of view. We have data that they link to compromised mental health worldwide. These are foods produced for corporate profits at the expense of public health. These foods are nutritionally inferior, and we know that the changing human brain is more susceptible to convenience and the overvaluation of neurochemical rewards, especially when distressed. Many people choose to eat these foods after understanding their implications, and this is important. The increased domination of industrial food processing has replaced traditional eating patterns. We all know that, but the worldwide trends in eating disorders closely parallel this transition. Maybe ultra-processed foods are causing a lot more incidents in eating disorders. So maybe it is about the food. Maybe the food does matter. Maybe the overconsumption of these foods are the cause and consequence of depression, addiction, and disordered eating. So all eating disorders treatment should not warrant this all foods fit dogmatic approach. We need to think about other health concerns. Eliminating some of these foods, including in eating disorder treatment, and the diet foods might actually help restore normal satiety mechanisms. Of course, this can be culturally challenging given how ubiquitous these foods are. And importantly, the percentage of the public who enjoy them without any consequences. They don't have any distress. Can we remove that from them to protect others? The answer is maybe. Are we there? Probably not. Probably have a couple of decades of research to do, just the way it took a couple of decades for the tobacco research to make a difference. But until we can mitigate the corporate capture of the nutrition field and regulate the big industries, we're left fighting amongst ourselves about divergent food philosophies, whether or not we should talk about ultra-processed foods. And these different perspectives do embody equally important overlapping social justice implications. And my call to action is that it seems wiser to join forces rather than to oppose. It may take a decade to integrate this food addiction science into the eating disorder field, but to try to do a counter field and then be at war doesn't make sense to me. We need people to think outside of the box and dialectically and do some peacemaking and some science rather than just personal emotional charge. If food neutrality is a goal, some people achieve it through inclusion, all foods fit. Others achieve it through avoidance. Could be harm reduction, could be abstinence. We desperately need more dialectics. We teach our patients to be less rigid and not think in black and white terms, but many professionals have adopted this cognitive distortion distortion regarding food philosophy. Tension is palpable. As a field, we can do better. Our patients deserve practitioners that prioritize individual intervention planning over dogmatic adherence to any singular treatment philosophy. So let's bring nuance back. Let's try to be more like water and less like rocks. And I'll meet you right there in the real world where we do evidence-based medicine, which combines the research with the expertise as well as patient preference. And that's me. Feel free to reach out. I'm very interested in follow-up conversations. Please check out the Wise Mind Nutrition app. Please get in contact with me. I look forward to hearing from you.